What's up, everyone? Do you want to implement versions, drafts, and live preview in your Payload CMS project, but you're running into roadblocks? I'm going to cover how to enable these features with examples in this video. If you'd like to see the code that I use, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. Versions enable you to maintain an audit log over time. You can track changes down to the user who made the changes and roll back changes as far back as you'd like. Enabling versions also allows you to enable drafts. Drafts require versions to be enabled and allow you to make changes to your document and save without publishing your changes. While we won't talk about it in this video, you can also enable the ability to schedule the publish date of your content. This requires the job queue and will be beyond the scope of this video. Adding drafts to your version option also gives you access to the autosave feature. The autosave feature isn't required for the live preview feature, but it does make your live preview experience much smoother. Live preview renders your front-end application with the admin panel so you can see real-time changes. This works by adding a simple component to your front end that acts as a listener to whenever a change is sent from your admin UI. In order to demonstrate all of these features, we're going to create a simple pages collection where we can create things like a homepage, about us page, and a portfolio page. We'll get started by first creating a new collection for our pages. In our collections directory, we'll create a new directory called pages. And in this directory, we will create a new file called config.ts. And then we're going to import collection config from payload. Then we'll import a couple of our blocks. So we'll have contentWithMedia from our contentWithMedia config. And then again, another block, our table of contents from our table of contents config. We can then export our constant pages with the collection config type assigned to it and add our slug option of pages and our fields, which we'll just do as an empty array. In our fields, we'll need 3 fields. The first one will be name slug, which will then have a type of text. Then we'll duplicate this and we'll do a name title. And then one more time, we'll duplicate and have this be the name blocks with the type blocks. And we'll include blocks content with media and our table of contents. Now, to make sure we use a more meaningful name, we'll change blocks to content. We can then import this into our payload config by finding our collections array and adding our pages here. In our front-end route group, we're going to create a new dynamic route called slug. So we're going to add a new directory, slug. And in this, we're going to create a new file called page.tsx. And then in this page, we can import get payload from payload. And we can import config promise from our payload config. And then we can import our render blocks component that we have made in a previous video. We'll then need to define our type args for our params, where it's going to be our params, which will be a promise. And in this promise, we'll have an optional slug that should be type string. Now we can export a default async function called page, which takes params promise, and this takes the type args that we just created. And then we can open up the function. At the top of this function, we will destructure our params promise with slug, with the default value being home, set that equal to await params promise. Then we'll initialize payload by awaiting get payload and using our config promise in our config. And then we can get the page. So we'll do our const page await payload.find. We'll get our pages collection where our slug equals slug. Then we'll get our response and process our response by taking our first document. Then we'll return a fragment that will have our h1, and this will be our page.title. And then we will have our render blocks, where we'll get page.content for our block content. Since our root page is going to be the exact same as all of our other pages, we can go to our front-end page.tsx, remove all of this, and just import our page template from our slug page, and then export default page template. Now let's load up our admin dashboard and create a homepage, about us page, and a portfolio page. So we will do our slug of home and title home. We'll hit save. Then we will duplicate this and do about us. And then one last time we'll duplicate and make this a portfolio. So now to test all of this worked, we can go to our local host and we can go to about us. We can see that our title is there. If we go to our home route, we see home, and the same thing will be true with portfolio. And once we get to the live preview, we'll add some more content here so we can see how the live preview works in real time. With our example set up, we can start exploring versions. To enable versions, you can simply add the versions option to your collection config. So we can add versions and just set this to true for now. When you activate this and your admin dashboard reloads, you can now see that this version tab shows up here. Clicking on this will enable you to see all versions related to this document. So if we go back to our home page and change our title to homepage, we can save this and see in our versions that there is one change logged here, updated at 4/17/2025. And if you just enabled versions like I did, you'll notice that everything changed. But now that this is initialized, I can go back and change my title back to home and hit save and go to the second version created, and we can see that I dropped the page from homepage and it's now just home, and the updated at time has changed as well. If you want more control over your versions, you can change true to be an object. And in this object, it takes max per doc, and it also takes drafts, which we'll just set as false for now until we go over drafts. Max per doc defaults to 100, so this is saying that it keeps 100 previous versions of this document before it starts deleting previous versions. You can use this to set however many versions you want to store per document in this collection. You can use version in globals as well. As an example, I'll go to our globals directory and just open our header global config. And we can add versions here, and we'll include drafts, which defaults to false, but just to show that it is available, you can see that there, and max. So max is the same as max per doc, but since globals cannot have more than one document, the global itself is the document, they don't use the term max per docs, just to make this make more sense. So again, this defaults to 100, but you can change this to be whatever number you want it to be. I don't want to enable versions for header, so I will delete that and close the file. What happens when you enable versions in either collections or globals is a new table is added to store the versions. This doesn't impact your data at all and happens automatically as soon as you enable it. Once enabled, you have access to new local API methods for both collections and globals. None of these are required or necessary for you to manage versions within your admin UI, but you can use them for more custom versioning workflows and hooks. The methods you activate for collections are find versions, find version by ID, and restore version. For globals, you get find global versions, find global version by ID, and restore global version. A new access control function is also made available, read version. This works exactly like the other access control functions where you can pass in a user to restrict or enable access to viewing versions. For example, if we want only editor users to read versions, we can pass in the editor access control we set up in a previous video. So I can use access, read versions, and then we can import our editor from our access. So now only when I'm logged in as an editor will I be able to see this versions tab. Now if I change this to admin, since I'm logged in as an editor, we'll see that I'm not authorized because I must be logged in to make this request, and I'm not allowed to access this page. But that's because I am currently an editor, and if I re-enable editor access, the versions tab shows back up. If you're enjoying this tutorial, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I release a new video about Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to it. Let's enable drafts in our pages collection. We can do that by simply changing false to true, or we can add some options in here, like autosave. And in autosave, we can accept an interval, and we can set that to be 100. Interval defaults to 800 milliseconds, which is how often autosave runs. We'll talk about live preview later, but you may want to set this interval to be closer to 100 for optimal live preview performance. So I just set this to 100 milliseconds for later in the video. You can also set schedule publish. So if I type in schedule publish, we see that pop up. And this defaults to false, and since we're not going to enable this for this video, we'll leave it as false. Schedule publish uses the jobs queue to schedule posts for you. I'll have more on this in a future video, so we'll set this to false for now and come back to it in the future. The last option available to you is validate, which I'll set as false. This defaults to false and overrides the validate operation for draft posts. This means you don't need to have all required fields filled out or in proper format before saving a draft like you would a published document. I'll leave validate as false like I said, but if you want stricter control over how your editors save draft documents, feel free to change this to true. When you enable drafts, a new field gets added to your schema by default, status. This field accepts draft or published, but when you enable drafts, it's blank. Let's see what this does to our data when we look at our pages collection. It looks like all of our documents are gone, but they're not. We can actually go to our home page still, our portfolio page, and our About Us page. All of the data is still there. The data doesn't get deleted, but when you enable drafts, the list view is looking for the status field in order to show documents. In order to fix this, we need to create a script that will resave all of our documents. Let's go back over to our payload config, and we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And here we're going to add the onInit option, which is going to take an async function, and we can pass in payload here and open up an arrow function. In this function, we're going to await payload update and look in the pages collection, pass in an empty where query just to make sure that we're not getting any results filtered out. And then we need to pass in our data, which is going to look for the status field, which starts with an underscore, and set that all to published. Now, if you were using a select field to set your published or your scheduled posts, you could use the where query here to make sure that you only put published posts from your old way into published posts here using status, and same with drafts. But here we don't have any previous data, we don't have a previous way of doing this, so we'll just use an empty where query and look on the status field to make them all published because I don't need any of them to be drafts. Now, the onInit function runs whenever we run our server. So we just stopped our server here, and I'm going to do our pnpm dev. And we'll see once we can refresh our admin page, we can see that all of our pages are back. And so I don't need this to run every time. I'm just going to comment it out so it's there in the repo at the end of the video. Instead of including the status field on your front-end queries, you can restrict draft access only to users. That way you don't have to do anything extra to hide drafts when querying your documents. You can do this by setting your read access in your pages config. So we'll set read, and we'll get our rec object here and open an arrow function. And we'll check if rec user, if there's a user and that user collection is equal to users, not our customers from a previous video, we can return true. So this will be only for the users who can access our admin panel. Then we can return our status equals published. Since we're logged in with our users collection, I can see all the documents. Even if I unpublish one, I'll see it still here in our list view. And beyond that, I can go to our portfolio on the front end and see it show up. Let's make some changes to our pages route so we can show how drafts can impact the front end as well. If I go to our pages dynamic route, we'll import our not found from next navigation. We'll also import our headers as get headers from next headers. And then in here, we can get our headers, const headers equals await get headers. We can also get our user by awaiting our payload auth and pass in our headers. We'll add the override access option to our payload find method and set it equal to Boolean user. So this will return true if a user exists. Under this, we'll add if there's no page, we can return our not found. Now, if we disable our auto login function, in our payload config by setting auto login to false. We can save, and once we refresh our portfolio, we can see that it is now a 404 not found. Once we enable auto login again, so we'll set it to true, we again have access to portfolio immediately. Since the new status field is added with a blank value, you may want to add to the where query that's returned in the case there is no user, so we can still see those blank values show up. We can do that by wrapping our status in a new object. Then we can use the OR and open up an array and put the status in this array. Then we'll include another status and set exists to false. So now if it's blank or published, it will return a page. The last topic we'll cover is the live preview. This doesn't require versions or drafts, but it can work better with autosave set. You can either initialize live preview in your payload config or in the collection or global you want to activate live preview. Let's do this from the payload config. Below our auto login option, we will include a live preview option. And live preview accepts an object. The first thing that we'll need to define is our collections that we want this to be initialized in. So for us, we only have the pages that's ready to take it. We also have the ability to add breakpoints. So we can define our own custom breakpoints here by including an array of objects with a label. For example, we'll do desktop. It'll also need a name, which we will again include as desktop. Then a width as a number, so we'll say 1440 by a height, which is another number of 1080. And these two numbers are pixel values. We can then create another one just so we have options, and we'll do a mobile view with a name of mobile and a label of mobile, and a width of 375 and a height of 667. And then we can fix this period here, and our breakpoints are set up now. Now under our breakpoints array, we need to include a URL option. While we could just do our local host, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have our live preview always start on our home page. It would make much more sense to use our collection slug to point the live preview directly to the page that we want to be editing. And we can do that with a relative URL that's dynamically populated with a function. So we're going to use a function that takes our collection, config, and our data as arguments, and open up an arrow function that will check the collection slug exists by checking collection config optional chain slug equals pages. If that's true, we can get our data slug. If it's not equal to home, we need to handle that differently. If it's not home, we can then use our data slug. Otherwise, it needs to be an empty string to show the home page. So we can save this and check how it looks configured this way. So we go to our pages and we can go to our home page and we can open up live preview. Now we can see the live preview showing up here, but if I make any adjustments, say to our title and publish the changes, we can see that nothing changes here in our live preview, but we update our homepage here to the new title. It's not until we refresh that we're able to see our live preview update. And that's obviously not ideal. That's not really a live preview. So that means we need to go to the next step and set up a listener on our front end. To do this, we'll need to expand on our geturl.ts utility that we created back in my video on redirects. In our utilities directory, we need to add a new file called canusedom.ts. And in canusedom.ts, we can export a default function that will check type of window does not equal undefined, and window.document exists, and window.document create element is also available. Essentially what this does is it checks if the window is defined and available for us to use and manipulate. This will prevent errors down the line. Now we can go to our already created geturl.ts file, and at the top of this file we can import our canusedom from canusedom, which is in the same directory. And below our get server side URL, we'll export a new constant called get client side URL and open up an arrow function. We can then check if can use DOM. And if that's the case, we'll use a new constant to break out our protocol, our host name, and our port from our window location. Below this, we can then return our protocol hostname port, and instead of this colon being here, we'll check if port even exists. If it does, then we can do our colon port. If not, we can do an empty string. If the requirements of can use DOM are not met, we can then check process.env.vercel project production URL. If that exists, we can return our HTTPS and then our URL for that, process.env.vercel project production URL. Otherwise, return our process.env next public server URL or an empty string. Now we can create our live preview listener. Create a new directory in your components folder called live preview listener. And in it, we can create a new index.tsx file. At the top of this file, we're going to use the use client directive, and then we're going to import our get client side URL from our utilities directory. Then we're going to also import use router from next navigation, and we're going to import React from React. There's another import we need to do, but first we need to install a new package. So I'm going to stop our server here, and we're going to run pnpm add our Payload CMS live preview React. Just like every other payload dependency, you need to make sure that that installs at the same version as the rest. And we can do that by going to our package.json, and we see that it is currently at 3.35. We need this to be 3.27.0. And then get rid of this pin, and then we can set them all to be the same by running pnpmi. So we can see that 3.351 has been dropped and 3.27 has been downloaded. So now I can close my package.json. Once that's installed, we're going to import from our Payload CMS live preview React. And what we're going to import is our refresh route on save, and we'll use an alias payload live preview just to make it a little bit more clear what we're doing. Then you can export a new constant called live preview listener, which will have the type of React FC, and we can set it equal to an arrow function. In the arrow function, we'll set a new constant router set equal to use router, and then we can return our payload live preview with refresh of router refresh, and our server URL, which is going to be our get client side URL. Now we can save this and go over to our front end to finish this up. So we'll go to our dynamic route slug page, and we're going to import our live preview listener from our components, and we will add draft to our payload find, which we're just going to set as the same as override access. And in the return here, we will check if there is a user. If there is, we can use our live preview listener and hit save and see how this works. When we load up our admin UI, we'll refresh for good measure. And so now with our listener, we can see in real time that our page is changing. Even when I add a block with our contentWithMedia block, I'm able to start typing. This is a contentWithMedia block, and I can set whichever text position I want, which will only really matter if I add an image in here. So I can set left, set right, and we see all these changes happening in real time. We can see a desktop view as well as a mobile view. And since I don't have any mobile stylings, that's just kind of how it's going to look regardless. Now, if we go to the draft document while we're logged in, so this is the home page, we're logged in so I can see these changes being applied. Unless I'm logged out, if I go to our payload config and I return false for auto login, I'm no longer able to see the draft, only the previous saved version. So I will re-enable our auto login, refresh, and be able to see our draft page there. Versions, drafts, and live preview are all powerful tools that help you manage your content, restrict access to content, and edit the content with a real-time preview of what your content will look like. They are all great tools to have at your disposal. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content around Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.